Hey, Record, my brother, what's up?
Hey Nick, I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. So when this podcast comes out, Academy of Management will be over. And we've talked about the Academy of Management CTO division and
And
how
you've
it's
you've run it for the first time, right? You're the program chair or something.
I was the program chair. That's a lot more work than you expect it to be. You got to deal with, and not only that, there were a bunch of visa issues this year. Apparently, the United States is making it more difficult to come in, especially if you're doing stuff around data and analytics and information. So there were a lot of visa issues. There was, of course, there was a lot. But I'll tell you what. One of the highlights of the event is it's every year we have a speaker, and the speaker is someone we pick. Not just, it's not like you give it to the old guy because it's their turn. You give it to the
Yeah.
person who really has a tremendous impact on the field and on CTO. So this year we had our invited talk by a guy named Paul Leonardi. You ever hear of that name?
Oh yes, I have. Of course, you can tell you when, like, because I remember the first time I came across this name was I think 2011. This was the year my first MIS quarterly paper came out, but more importantly, this was the year that he got I think it was the best paper of the year award for his imbrication, the famous imbrication
Imbrication.
paper. Yeah,
Yeah.
in the car industry, technology and organizing imbricated. And tell you what, like I, as a non-native speaker, I had to look up in a real dictionary. I was like, what the fuck is imbrication? I have no idea
I
what that
still
word
don't know
means.
what it is. Uh, so anyway, so we invited Paul on board. Welcome, Paul. How you doing?
Hey guys, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. It's like 6 a.m. for you in the morning, but you told us you're an early dog, so I hope that's okay.
Yeah, as long as you're not sharing the video, then I didn't have to comb my hair or anything, so we're fine.
Yeah. So the imbrication paper actually won another award like 10 years later, didn't it? From MISQ.
Yeah, it was just selected as the 10th, they do this new thing now where you do a
That's
most
right, they
impactful
do.
paper over the last 10 years.
Yeah, like a test of time award, right? They got this in
Yes.
a variety of fields. I think they copied that from AOM. They have that award, and they also have that in computer science. In computer science, they call that the test of time award. That's right. Yeah, I remember that because I was a little bit involved in this, and you were picked as the first inaugural winner or one of the few. Yeah, yeah, rightfully so. We should add, right? That was a great paper. Um,
Oh, thank you.
and I think it
So
was one
in,
of these papers. Sorry, and it was one of these papers where it's like, yeah, of course. I remember saying like, yeah, of course. That's exactly how it is. Of course it is, right? This is one of these papers where, in hindsight, it kind of looks obvious, but of course it's not. It's just one of these quality criteria of a really good theoretical paper that, in hindsight, you're like, yeah, of course it's like that. Well, someone had to point it out, I guess.
so Paul, what the heck is imbrication and why that word? Why that
I
word?
don't
Why pick a word no one knows what it means?
I don't know. Well, okay. You want the real answer or do you want my PC
Yeah.
answer?
This is
Because
back. This is the true story here
we're
in our
on your
podcast.
podcast that talks
Yeah.
about true stories inside of
Yeah.
stuff, right? Okay, so I would say the true story is I don't know how to write a theoretical paper. I still don't know how to write a theoretical paper. But
Oh
you need
no.
something, and the reviewers are always asking for something new. So I was looking for something new. The
Hmm.
phenomena wasn't new, but I guess the way of talking about it was somewhat new. It's not a word that I came up with. It's a word that there's a guy named by the name of Jim Taylor who passed away a few years ago, who was in communication at the University of Montreal. And
Hmm.
he had written a book that I really liked a lot called The Computerization of Work. And
Hmm.
in that book, he talked about this idea of imbrication. And I thought, that's like, I get it. He's talking about this overlapping, these separate things, and then they overlap, and then they're not separate anymore. And were they really separate ever to begin with? And it was sort of a philosophical treatise on technology and work. And I thought, oh, that seemed like a useful concept that people in the fields that I'm reading a lot haven't seemed to talk about. And maybe that's new enough to describe what I'm doing that the reviewers will finally say you have a theoretical contribution. Because it seems
Yeah.
like every single paper I've ever published, the reviewers are always telling me, this is data are interesting, but you don't really have a theoretical contribution. So
Yeah.
perhaps had the reviewers not pushed so much, we wouldn't have the funny term imbrication in this paper. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if the paper needs it, but it got it because the reviewers told me I needed something.
That's a good point. I don't think the paper actually needed, right? So you can tell the same story without having that one concept in there. But tell me this, like, that word imbrication, was that in version 0 or did that come through in one of the review rounds? Do you remember that?
I don't think that it was in version 0. It's hard to remember. Um,
So you thought
That
it was
paper, like every paper, goes through so many different versions along the way. All I do remember is that the reviewers were constantly pushing me to like, we like your story, we think it's interesting, it's illustrated nicely with data, but we still don't feel like you've nailed this contribution. And so tell us something different. What I do remember is that in an early version of that paper, that concept of imbrication came at the end. So I thought that it made sense to really work through the data and then sort of induct the concept from the data, like show the patterns happening and then say this is an instance of imbrication occurring. And that throughout the review process, it ended up moving to the beginning of the paper so that the data actually were presented as more of an illustration.
Yeah.
As opposed to a set of findings and then look at what we inducted from the findings.
Which is actually a nice strategy if you think about it, right? It's just like, I think there's even a word for this writing strategy, that you tell the Big Bang up front, and then you tell people how you got to the Big Bang, right? It's not really the chronological order in which you actually arrived at the new concept and the new idea, but it's a nice way of telling it. Sort of like, I tell you what happens on the first 10 pages, and then if you're still interested, you can read on.
Yeah, the thing that's annoying about that from a writer's standpoint is I spent a whole hell of a lot of time collecting those data. And the concepts only came because I spent a whole hell of a lot of more time analyzing those data. And so it looks like I had this grand theory, and then I just found some data that supported the theory. And I don't like that because I did a lot of work to come up with that. But I don't know. It is what it is, I guess.
Well, that's the struggle we have with qualitative research, isn't it? That from any given data set, you could probably tell a number of different stories, right? So that you start taking it into a story, and then in the review process, just about anything we say as qualitative researchers, someone could argue that's been said, right? Because what are we looking at? In the end, it's about humans, and it's about humans interacting with each other, right? And on some level of abstraction, whatever we're saying about humans interacting has been said. So the review process takes you into that direction. You need to sweep that into kind of the front. So what we want to say, look, these are the people I was talking to. This is the research I did. This is my findings. We want to craft a paper in that manner. But over time, the paper's kind of a negotiation between us and the editors and the reviewers and what they think. From their perspectives, right? So I always think, Paul,
it's completely a negotiation.
What do you think of this? I always think that what you just described is what I end up doing with every qualitative paper. I write the paper, and then I have my findings in the back as a result of my analysis. Whatever my initial findings are, I end up moving those to the front, and then taking most of it off the table with the literature, and then end up having to, whether it's in the review process, whether it's ahead of time, I end up having to find additional contribution, because they always tell me whatever you found is already out there.
I couldn't agree with that more. Let me phrase it slightly differently, or explain it in a slightly different way. I think that I always tell my PhD students when I'm working with them and they're entering the field for the first time, that you're never going to find anything really interesting or impactful if you haven't done your reading ahead of time. And the reason is that all the frameworks that we read about and that we learn about help us to see things. And so when you're in the field and you see something and it appears interesting, it's interesting in relationship to what you've already read, because it confirms something that you've read, or it disconfirms something that you've read before. And all of that theory, or the prior empirical findings, just are like lenses, right, that help you to understand what's going on in the field. So you never would have really arrived at the thing that you found, I don't think, if you hadn't prepared yourself well ahead of time to encounter the thing that you found. That's not saying that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? But what it is saying is that if you are well prepared, things that surprise you will surprise you for a reason. And that reason is often the reason for writing a paper. The problem is that then you can almost always go back and come up with some post hoc rationalization for the thing that you found
Yeah.
occurring in the field. But you never would have seen that thing in the field had you not been sensitized to it by the stuff that you read. So it's kind of a chicken and egg problem in some ways. I think that we actually do have a lot of findings, but yes, could some prior theory or combination of perspectives have explained that? Sure, but you never would have put those things together had you not seen the thing in the field. So you're always struggling with the fact that maybe what you found is novel, but now you're sort of forced into a genre as you're writing a paper of setting up a framework that really still does hew very closely to a deductive kind of method, right? Which is, I have to put all this theory up front as though I were generating a hypothesis, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to propose a research question. But now I've sort of preempted my findings so much that it looks like I just found the thing that I set up to find.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really interesting what you say there, because I was brought up in the complete opposite direction. And in a way, that's how I tell my students. So I tell my students all the time, let's go into the field first, like not first, but really, really early. Let's go into the organization. Let's go and have a look and let's see what they're doing without being blindfolded, not blindfolded, but, without getting a tunnel view that we probably would have gotten from reading particular theoretical frames. And then, everything looks like what you said, like a hammer looks like a nail. Right. Because I think the risk that you're running with your strategy is, of course, that you end up with gravity in the kitchen kind of syndrome. If you're too strong in some theoretical frame, then in fact everything looks like a nail to that hammer, and that's exactly what you're gonna find. So, can you spot that interesting new insight that would add up on that body of literature? Sure, but it's actually really difficult. Now, the problem with my strategy, with the opposite strategy, is that we always got to end up with findings, and it's really difficult to construct a theoretical contribution because you do have to go back and do the reading and then, disconfirm that your finding is in fact new. And of course, 95% of the time, it's not. You just didn't know because you hadn't done the reading yet. Mm-hmm. So I do think, I don't think that one strategy is better than the other, but they both have, a strength, but they all have significant risks, right? The gravity in the kitchen risk, or you're confirming something we've already known for 20 years already. Spend a lot of work on writing up something that people have told us 30 years ago.
Yeah, there's certainly no ideal strategy, and I think you point out the pros and the cons really nicely.
So, Paul, you, I think of our generation, you're the most prolific qualitative researcher, social theoretic researcher we have in information systems, right? I think you're the man. If you were to give us qualitative researchers, young people in our field, advice, right? So you started with read. I like that a lot. And of course, do good research and all that. But are there tricks? Are there practices that you do that you think have really contributed to your success that you think, you could inform us about? I'll tell you a rumor I heard about you. You want to hear the rumor? Yeah, this is apparently, and this was probably a decade ago that I heard that you were talking to some qualitative researchers. And they said that what you did, and let me see if I get this right. I think it was, you said that the method section before your qualitative research, you would write a lot of pages, like 4 pages, 5 on the first submission. So there's the case study that you present, but then there's the method, and you would write a lot of pages, and you wouldn't do a lot of citations. Like a lot of people will throw in the Yin citation, the Eisenhart citation, grounded theory. They just pepper it with citations, but don't really say what they did. You don't throw in the citations, but you say a whole bunch about the research process before you ever get into the case. And that if you have a lot of pages in the first submission, people think you must have done good work and they give you a chance at a revision, right? Is that true? Is this coming from you?
That is true. I have said that a number of years ago. Boy, this was probably, I know. I just had my first daughter. She was 6 months, and so that was 2012. It must have been. And I got invited to do this internet. What was it called? Like an international visiting fellow or something for. I'm just totally blanking on the whole thing. But whatever the UK's equivalent of the NSF is, the ESRC, maybe. Mm-hmm. They had this program. Oh, I know. Advanced Institute of Management had this visiting fellow program. And so they invited people out. You had to go to 3 universities across the UK and visit, and then give a talk at the university, a research talk and a methods talk. And so I was like, well, what am I supposed to say as the methods talk? So I really, really thought about it a lot. Like, well, what am I actually doing right now? And the prompt was, that we want, the whole reason they did this was that you're changing the evaluation criteria and wanted to have scholars in the UK publishing more in top US journals. And so my brief was, how do you publish qualitative research in top management journals? And of course, there's no like secret to it, but I tried to think about like, what are the things I could say? So I came up with this little thing, 2 truths and a lie, like based on that game. And I think that the truth was, or no, the lie was that you should never, or you should, the lie was you should never cite Glaser and Strauss in your paper. And the reason that it was a lie, that you had to sort of detect that. Of course, everyone thought that was a truth, right? That you should always cite Glaser and Strauss. And I said, that's actually a lie. And the reason is that if you write a method section and you end up citing the folks that you just mentioned, right? Yin, Eisenhardt, Glaser and Strauss, so on and so forth, that you're actually, in most cases, saying, I did a method that they told me to do, and I followed these high-level things. And I guess you could add like Joya to it at the moment, right? Like I followed the Joya method or whatever it was. Okay, but that's nice that you followed a method where you did some first level codes and then you identified some analytic categories and then you grouped them together. But what did you actually code and what did you actually group together and like all this stuff? And in my mind, and as a reviewer, right, I don't see a lot of that happening in the paper. And so I said, what I think is the better thing to do is that you actually write it shit ton, right, about what you actually did, enough that it's going to bore the hell out of the reviewers, but give them the confidence that you've actually spent time working with your data. And inevitably what's going to happen is they're going to tell you later, it's really good that you wrote all that stuff, but you need to trim your manuscript down by 10 pages. And the method section looks kind of bloated. And by the way, you haven't cited the important folks like Glaser and Strauss. And so what ends up happening is your method section went from 9 pages to 3. And then, you throw in all these Glaser and Strauss citations. And so I told them, if you look at my papers, you'll pretty much always see citations to Glaser and Strauss or Strauss and Corbin or, Kathy Eisenhardt or whatever. But those were almost never there in the first round. And they end up there after a while. But I think what it does is it showcases to the review team that you actually really did follow a fairly rigorous method. And whether that method corresponds to what Glaser and Strauss do, or any of the other folks that you mentioned, doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter. Yeah. What matters is that you have clarity on the analytical process that you went through. Yeah. In fact, I feel guilty that many of my papers cite Glaser and Strauss. And I actually try to cite Strauss and Corbin more than Glaser and Strauss, because I don't think I really do grounded theory in the way that Glaser and Strauss talk about it. Yeah. When I was getting my PhD at Stanford, I took a seminar. It wasn't like a whole seminar. It was like a little short course from Barney Glaser. I don't know. I think he was visiting sociology. And I had no idea what the hell grounded theory was by the time that was over. I thought I knew at the beginning. All I knew at the end of it was that I certainly didn't do it, because it was this whole kind of weird mystical thing where and I don't know. I'm much more
because he's not a constructionist, right? Strauss was the constructionist of the two, right?
Well, but I think the thing that Strauss did that I like is that he, in that book with Julia Corbin, got real specific about this is how you code things, and like how you identify something in the data. And that's always been more useful for me.
I think so too. I mean, he got a little bit dogmatic, right? This is the only way you can code, and then it got a bad rap for it. Strauss and Corbin somehow got a bad rap. But if you look at it closely, that's just a really useful thing. Like look for context, look for action, look for event, look for consequence. That's really useful if you don't know what you're doing, and it's more useful than some of the generic advice like do open, do actual, do selective coding. What the hell am I supposed to be doing? I like what you said, Paul. I tend to follow the same thing. Like I always make sure that in the first version 0, my method section's got to be a couple of pages long. And because I think it portrays to the reviewers that you know what you're doing, that you're being rigorous. Because one of the knockout criterion, I think, for a qualitative paper is you get a paper and it has this half-page method section, including data collection and analysis, half a page on both of these things, where we all know, there's a lot to talk about. So I think that's the throwout criterion. And then, of course, the flip side to it is just give them more. And the second thing I wanted to add to this is that I think one of the dangerous things that young scholars do is they look at a published paper for method advice and so like, oh, that's what they did. They did these 4 generic high-level things. I'm going to do the same thing. And then they wonder, why did my paper get rejected? And I think it's a misleading thing to do, because what actually happens in the later rounds is that your method section gets trimmed down by at least 50% usually. It's like, okay, let's make this paper readable. No one wants to read all this detailed stuff that he told us, right? So in my head, I always think about, well, in the first couple of review rounds, I want to convince the reviewers that I'm doing rigorous work. And once they're convinced, they're switching to this other mode or this editing mode and saying, like, let's make your paper accessible. And then, of course, whatever ends up being published actually has a very short method section that doesn't give actually a lot of detail away that probably in version 1 or version 2 was in the paper. So I think that's misleading for junior scholars. They shouldn't look at the published version. They should have version 1 or whatever that usually they can't get access to.
Yeah, it's a great point, Jan. And my thought about this is that your papers at different rounds are supposed to do different things. So when you submit the paper in the first round, that your goal is to convince the reviewers that, number one, this is a very well executed study. And you do that by adding all that data into the method section. Number two, that the paper has good findings that say something interesting and important. That's like your primary job in round 1, I think. If you get farther than that. I think maybe in my whole career I've had one paper that got conditionally accepted on the first round or something. But then I had to do like a bunch of rounds of review afterwards. So why did they bother conditionally accepted? It felt like it was, it was nice because they basically said, we will publish this if you don't fuck it up after this, except I still had to do like 3 rounds of review. But your job is not to get your paper published after round 1. Your job is to convince those reviewers that you've got something here so that on the next round, that they're not questioning anymore. Do we believe this? Do we believe these findings? Do we think that the reviewer or that the author has done a rigorous enough job? They can now help you fine tune what you're working on and how you're framing it. And then that often continues through several subsequent rounds, unfortunately, much to our chagrin. But you have a different goal, right, in round 1 than you do in round 2, 3, and so on.
So Paul, this is what I'm hearing. Excuse me. This is what I'm hearing from you. First round, methods have 4 pages, 6 pages, 8 pages of what you did, what I did first, what I did second, how you arrived at what you were at. And then I think your data, your findings have a lot of quotes, have a lot of be convincing. Mm-hmm. Of the paper, most of your papers should be those 2 sections for first submission. Have a small back end, a small front end, because that stuff has to be negotiated with your review team over the course of the next 4 rounds, right? Where they're going to tell you what you missed and this, they'll want you, right? They'll do one, but it's like to get past the first round, that middle section, just be totally convincing. And then, know your literature and then frame it to the literature that and then hopefully you say something, but this will evolve in a few rounds. Is that and the other thing, by the way, because this is Paul who we're talking to, Recker, and it's like you read any of his stuff, it's just beautifully written. I think you take a course in writing, right? Shorter sentences, direct sentences, right? So where did you learn to write like that, by the way, Paul?
I don't know. I was a communication major as an undergrad, so did a lot of writing.
Helps.
Yeah.
So that is something I wanted to ask you about, whether you think there's truth to it, or whether this is one of these unnerving stereotypes that to publish good qualitative research you have to be a good writer. That's one way to frame it. The other way to frame it is, you get your stuff published not because you're doing good research, because you write so well. It's sort of like I hear both of these, I guess, sentiments. I guess. What's your take on this? Like, do you have to be a good writer to publish qualitative research, or, the more negative angle to it?
I think you have to be a good writer to publish just about anything. Good writing is important because it helps people understand your message. I think that there's a different style of writing that you use in qualitative research. I published a number of papers that are much more deductively driven and use some kind of form of regression analysis rather than present qualitative data. And the style of writing in those is quite different. I think that for qualitative work, you have to be able to allow someone to see themselves sitting in your context, right? They have to be able to see the practices you're describing unfolding, right? Or the process happen. They have to be able to understand why the people that you're describing or the actions that the organization is taking are unfolding the way that they are. And you end up having to write in a way that sucks you into a story in the data, as opposed to when you're writing in a much more deductive kind of paper. The story has happened in the development of the hypotheses. And then really what you're doing is you're being as explicit as possible in the writing in the results section to be very clear about what the findings tell us and what they don't tell us relative to the story that you already spun in the development of hypotheses. So I think that clear writing is really important for both, but how you think about that writing is very different. In a more deductive paper, I feel like I'm writing an instruction manual in some ways, right? At least in that genre. I'm not trying to belittle it, but that I'm trying to be very clear and declarative at every step along the way. And when I'm writing a qualitative piece, I'm trying to write more of a children's book, like that you're trying to suck people in and get them excited about the story and the participants. So take, Steve Barley, for example, who was my advisor and a colleague at UCSB, and obviously one of the great qualitative researchers in technology and organizations and a wonderful writer. But he's always really good at putting people into the context. And everyone talks about his papers on CT scanners because you felt like you were in the hospital with these folks, right? Yeah. And that's one of the powers, I think, of writing and qualitative work.
Let me. Can I test a little hypothesis here? Most of the qualitative papers that I read and that I get to handle as a reviewer, editor, or whatever, they're all inductive, right? So whether they're grounded or not, but they're all inductive, right? So as if the one thing they all try to avoid is doing a good old deductive case study. And my hypothesis, it would be so nice to do more very classic Yin style deductive case studies where, you test competing theories or you test the theory against your case, but no one seems to like it. It's like out of fashion in a way. And we talked about this, Nick, a couple of times. Every now and then we get one of these classic papers, where they take 1 or 2, 3 theories and compare it to this one case to see which of these theories actually explains what they observed. But no one wants to do that. Would you agree with this? I think it would be nice to see more classic deductive case studies. Is my argument here. Would you agree?
Classic deductive case studies. Yeah, I mean, I think it would. We're so rewarded for novelty rather than replication. Yeah. So I think that's one part of it. And anything that smells of replication, whether it is or it isn't, is looked down upon. So the promise of qualitative research is always that you're going to find something new and that you're building theory and you're not testing theory. So I think that draws a lot of people to want to publish in that domain. But then you get a lot of garbage too, because you're trying to theorize about stuff that either doesn't matter or the data are thin on. And I think as a reviewer, my experience has been that the number one reason that I reject a paper, or as an editor, senior editor, right, that I'll reject a paper, is that the research question doesn't line up well with the methods that somebody used. So they're really asking a deductive question. They're asking a variance-based question, and then they go out and do this like field study where they're collecting all kinds of really interpretive data. And I'm like, the problem was that you should have really just generated a hypothesis about this and gone out and tested it. So I think that you see that happen a lot. And I think that's a problem, right? That you don't have that match.
I have another theory on why you don't see it, Wrecker. Right. I think that the reason you see hypothesis testing and qualitative case-based research in the 90s and early 2000s is because that's the only thing people knew. Yeah, so they were essentially harking, right? Like, I'm not going to put words in Lynn Marcus's mouth, but she told me once about that 1983 paper.
Yeah.
And the way I remember her story about that 1983 paper was that it went 12 rounds at Communications, the ACM. And if you know which one I'm talking about, it's Power and Politics.
Power Politics,
right. I can't remember if it's a hypothesis testing or not, but it went 12 rounds because that was in the 80s. They weren't publishing qualitative work to Barley's paper wasn't even out yet at that point, right?
Yeah.
Barley and Orlikowski didn't write their great work that everybody was imitating after that. I think that at that point, the only thing people knew was hypothetical deductive. And like, if you look at Yin's book and case studies, he likened each case to an experiment.
Exactly.
So he really thought that the way you're going to do it is, you hypothesize, you run the experiment, you go there. I think what's happened is we are more faithful to the actual research enterprise with everybody in their inductive, because I think that's what happens. You get an opportunity to go into a company, you go start analyzing the company, and then whatever you're doing emerges. So we can be honest now. I think a lot of those people in the 90s reframed their inductive experiences as hypothetical deductive.
Well,
right?
I agree, but the downside, of course, to all this inductive work is that everyone wants to do inductive because, first of all, you don't have to read. Second of all, I think one of the reasons for that is that we're all looking for theoretical contributions, and what easier way to show a theoretical contribution than to come up with a new concept or to claim to come up with a new concept? How do you get that? Well, you found it in your one data set and say, hey, here's this new thing, and it's
imbrication, guys.
Yeah, imbrication, exactly. And, so that's what everyone's doing. So the danger there is, of course, that we're being flooded. We're being flooded with all these new concepts and these new constructs, and they come up, and we do need some homework to see which of them is really important. I was seeing this, it was a Twitter post or something, but it was, okay, here are the 10 concepts that came out of organizational psychology, I believe, that you probably still believe that's not been, that's been debunked a long time ago, like grit and the power of 10,000 hours and stuff like this. So, we're flooding the world with concepts through a lot of inductive work. And then, we need to sort out which of them are really important, which of them we need to build into a cumulative tradition, which of them we can forget about.
Yeah. I mentioned this once before, but I think that the genres in which we write, or the genres that are typical in our journals, are often still problematic for really good qualitative research and work that is really inductive. So we have to have a theory section, right? That's upfront. And then we separate our data analysis from our findings as though we did all the data analysis and then the findings magically came out of it, when there's really an interplay between all three of those things, right? The theories that we use, the way that we look at our data, how we analyze it, the very sequential nature of I uncovered this in my data, and then that made me go and read some more. And so then I did some different kind of analysis. And I think we would have very different kinds of papers if we were allowed to write, or we had an institution of writing in a different genre. One of the papers that, if you haven't taken a look at it in a while or have never read it, I'd encourage you to look at, is Deborah Doherty's paper on innovation. What does she call it? Innovation. Oh, I forget the name of it. It's a 1992 paper in organization science. And she's got these different groups of people. It's almost like a technological frames kind of paper. They look at sort of the product development process differently in all of these different groups. And somehow she wrote this paper in the exact genre that I would love to write a paper in, where there's like 4 method sections in the paper, because it was, first I did this, so I analyzed the data and here were the findings. And then that made me analyze these data. So then I present some more analysis, and then here were the findings. And then here's another analysis that I did because it fell out of those findings. And here's another one. And, you probably experienced this, where you're describing in your method section what you did. And so then you want to give a couple examples of the thing that you found based on that. And then you're like, well, I can't put that there because that needs to go in the findings. I need to save it for the findings. Or, you did things in round 1 of your analysis and it created a finding, and then you couldn't have done the round 2 analysis. So you're like, well, do I explain the finding in the method so that I can then motivate why I did the round 2 analysis? It's just like we're trying to take a paper that shouldn't be theory method results, and we're pushing it into a theory method results genre. And so even ones that might look really interesting are being perverted in this terrible way because you're trying to conform to a genre that doesn't really fit the mode of analysis that you went through.
Yeah. Emma Vast and Natalia Levina have a 2006 paper in OrgSci on codification where they, I don't know if you've read this,
and
but
method. Yeah.
they
No
went
background.
introduction, no lit review. They went
Yeah.
right into, it was grounded. They went right into the method, and then they had findings in the back end, right? Which is as inductive what you're saying. So we're running into that with computationally intensive inductive papers as well,
Sure.
because, you know, you're mixing and matching different methods, and you're bringing them together to try to construct a theoretical contribution. And what ends up happening is exactly what you're saying. The findings of this phase impact this, what you do in the next. And it's like this detective story. But here's the deal with the Vast and Levina paper, with the computationally intensive papers, is that's what you did. And the big problem is no one wants to read what you did. They want the so what, and they want the evidence for your so what. What's your claim? What's your evidence? Yes, we need to have faith in what you did, but no one wants to read that in the paper form. They want a summary of it, perhaps. And I think in some of my papers, I try to do like a diagram. And in a couple with Aaron Lindbergh, what we did is we had kind of a methodological column and then a theoretical column, and then we showed like a back and forth, or, you know, we tried to do that but I think it's hard because we want to describe what we did as researchers, but our reader and our editors, they just want, what did you find?
Yeah, I guess my pushback here, not to your observation, Nick, I agree with it, but to the institution that we work in, is, you know, you read about all this replication crisis that's going on and the lack of faith that people have in findings and so on and so forth. It seems to me that we would be doing better in our journals if we did have a chronicle of what people did, you know, whether we had a set of processes, right? That I could go and I could follow this. Like I can see they read this, and so that's why they collected this kind of data. Makes sense to me. They collected that kind of data and they did this analysis and they found this. That makes sense. So then it makes sense why they did this next thing, right? So that maybe the papers are less exciting in terms of theoretical contribution, but they're much more transparent about what they did along the way. I mean, that's the problem with most qualitative research. You know, that 6 or 8 page method section that we talked about is fairly transparent and tells exactly what you did, but who gets to publish that? Almost nobody, because it gets stripped away and you got to cite your canonical sources and it gets reduced for length. So I think a lot of it comes down to, well, what do we want to see in a paper? And as we have certainly pushed more and more towards, you need to have an important theoretical contribution, the discussion sections of these papers just become longer and longer and longer. And even the findings become shorter and shorter and shorter, even for qualitative research. And that's where the most interesting stuff should be.
Yeah, that is true. Although I do think that, you know, in a good qualitative paper, like the back end, that should be really rich and thick and, you know, in other words, pretty long. And, you know, and you got 30 pages. I mean, what do? You cut down the findings, right? I mean, I've had people tell me that, can you edit your quotes and literally the quotes, the evidence, and can you cut out some stuff and make them shorter somehow? And I was like, well, isn't that changing what people said? That's kind of feels weird, right? Anyway, so I do think there's something to it. You said something really interesting in the beginning. I wanted to piggyback on this. You said something like, I'm not a theory kind of guy or something like this, right? And I was like, whoa, that's not really how you're being portrayed to the outside. Like, I think from the outside, people would, you know, they know you for imbrication, of course. They know you for social materiality, I think. They know you for your affordances in communication and social media technologies. Now, all three of them are big theoretical advances.
Yeah, I don't think we know.
I think that people know that more than the fact that you've actually studied the cobbling industry.
Recker, he's not socio-materiality. He's materiality. Right.
Fine. Whatever. My point is, I think to the outside world, people would know you more for your theoretical lenses and your contributions there than, for example, in the actual case context that you studied.
Interesting. Well, I don't see myself that way. I certainly see myself as an empiricist first and foremost. And I tend towards qualitative research because I tend to ask process and practice questions. And, it's the how questions, right? Like, how does somebody do something, or how does something happen? And because those are the questions I tend to be interested in, coupled with the fact that I just think work is cool. And I love to learn what different kinds of jobs people are doing. I was on a dairy farm last week collecting some data about sort of digital transformation that's happening in farming,
of
and
milk,
got
digital
literal
transformation
shit
of
on my
milk.
field, all over my field notes, and it was fascinating to learn how a dairy farm operates. So like that always drives me. So I think of myself as somebody who is constantly mucking around in the data, and
Yeah.
but that's not enough to publish a paper, right? So you have to find some theoretical conversation to enter into or to change in order to get a paper published.
Yeah. So, and if you look at your career, I think so my favorite paper of yours has always been your 2008. It's one of your early papers, I imagine, in INO on materiality. I've cited that probably more times on so many of my papers, and I remember reading it at the time. I never thought about this stuff. That was early. No one was talking about affordances, right? That whole idea of technological determinism and voluntarism and all that. So I just want to say thank you for that paper. That one opened my eyes, and to this day, I think it holds up. That was very cool. And you did that when you were a PhD student, right?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Or
So that was
right
cool.
right as I graduated, somewhere around there.
So you made these intellectual contributions early in your career that were huge earlier, and then now you, of course, continue to
now
research.
nothing.
Well, yeah, but you continue to publish and do really interesting research. I know you have this the transparency visibility behavioral visibility paper that we're using in one of my projects. But what I've noticed about you is that you're doing a bunch of practitioner stuff too. Way more like in recent years, I guess, and including this digital mindset book, which I picked up because I'm doing an executive thing this fall on digital transformation and the digital mindset. So I'm like, I better learn something about digital mindset. So I read your book, and the fact is, it's for muggles, right? It's for those people who know nothing about technology. So you're doing such a bunch of random, like, why are you writing a book for muggles about, the basics? It's almost like an information systems 101 book, right?
You get tired, right? Like, you just get tired of doing the same thing over and over
Thank
again.
you.
Talking to the same audiences.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like,
Nick doesn't get that. Yeah.
At some point, like, how many more papers do you need in organization science, like, or wherever? I don't know. I try some different things. I have been doing more consulting jobs recently, and I really like those because they're so different than my day job, right? Like, they are actionable immediately. There's a problem, somebody wants to solve it. They don't want to talk about it for 3 years. They want to talk about it for 3 weeks and figure out a problem, figure out a solution. You can sort of guide them down a path, and you can make some recommendations, and they typically listen to your recommendations. And
they want a good enough solution. They don't want a good solution. They want a good enough solution.
Yeah, right. Because they got to get stuff done. And it's interesting. I in that role, I really just view myself as a qualitative researcher providing them insights, and then a translator. When I say, okay, so here's the things that you got going on. Number one, did you know that these were going on? And the answer is normally no. Then number two, I can tell you what the general solution is to this problem because somebody has researched this before, right? And we know that you're supposed to do things A, B, and C to solve if you have this particular problem that I've identified. And then, so that's like the science part. And then the creativity part is, well, how could you actually do A, B, and C? If A is, well, you need to make sure you increase employee retention. What are the levers that you have to be able to do that? And so that's a sort of next round of almost qualitative research that I do with the organization to figure out what levers they do have and which ones they could pull to fix this problem. So I like that kind of stuff, and it's just something different. So I don't know. I feel, that digital mindset book has, I think, done pretty well. For people that listen to this podcast, it won't have any insights that are really great in it, I don't think. But it's not meant to in some ways, right? It's meant to be a work that translates for people who are concerned that they don't understand the basics of collaboration, computation, and how change looks in a digital era. And how do you get to a sort of minimal level of competency in those areas? And I've been happy that the people that read the book with that frame of reference seem to be feeling like they're getting something out of it.
Can I ask you,
Yeah.
as an author,
Yeah.
how's the writing experience? I mean, you said, you wanted to try something different. I get that.
Mhm.
We haven't written, like Nick, we haven't written a book for practitioners. So what was different? Did you enjoy that? Just writing a very different style, different type of narrative, different, was it, or am I making this up?
It's challenging in a different way. I think the hardest thing for me is that I feel like I never support my claims enough. That's the hard part. The editors tell me that I have too much support for my claims, and I feel like I don't have enough. And that's because in the academic genre in which we write, that's your job, right? Is to show all of the evidence and ad
Yeah.
nauseum, right? So that you are drowning in it. And for a more practitioner oriented audience, that seems to be not the case, at least with the editors that I've had at various places. Like
Yeah.
too many examples, right? You're going too deep here. One will do. This takes way too long to read through to get the context. And so you really have to simplify it and provide one or two key anecdotes, and then use the notes, I guess, in the back, right, to cite all the studies that you're citing and to give a little more context for it. So I'm a little uncomfortable still with that part. I do find that editors actually edit. So almost nobody is
Yeah,
giving you feedback on your ideas,
yeah.
right? It's all about how you present the idea and how you communicate the idea, and how the piece, whether it's an HBR article or a book or whatever, how that's structured. So that experience is very different. I
Yeah.
kept waiting for them to come back and push back. Well, I don't know about that practice that you recommend. Like, I don't agree with that, or
Yeah.
give me more evidence. But nobody ever says that. It's all
Yeah.
about, I didn't understand enough about how to do this thing. Here, I wrote up a little paragraph for you. Does this work? Does this explain it?
Yeah. That's cool.
That
So
is cool.
I do have to say, when your book, it's really in the chapters, you did cite research in a sense, right? Like you would
Oh, yeah.
pick a couple of researchers, you'd name their university, and then you would say what they found. So it's all based in research. And I could tell that. And it was clearly evident. I'll tell you what I don't like about a lot of the things I read. So this doesn't apply to you, but a lot of the things I'm reading in a lot of practice-based stuff is we're snake oil salesmen, right? What are your 3 or 4 practices for that you should do if you want to do a digital transformation, for example? And go look at digital transformation. Go look at 3 or 4 practices. There are tons of articles that say these are the 3 or 4 practices, none of which could possibly be evidence based because we don't have enough understanding. We just simply
Have the
don't have enough
evidence, right?
empirical research into digital transformation, yet we have a ton of snake oil salesmen telling you how to do it effectively, right? And that's my problem with a lot of these kind of practitioner oriented projects that you read about and that they're hungry for is what are your 3 to 5 things I should do? And people will give them their 3 to 5 things they should do. And either one, it's no different than what I would have told them to do in 1980. So it's like the same change management 3 or 4 steps. Or 2, they're making stuff up that they have no evidence for. And yet we love it. We eat it up and people publish it and they get it in HBR, they get it wherever, right? And I don't know. What do you think? Is there a bunch of snake oil being sold, or do you think I'm overreacting to the stuff I read? And
Well, I mean, generally, I agree. There probably is. And I don't know that it's pernicious necessarily always in the way that you describe it. I think that a lot of that kind of stuff gets published because that was my experience. Like I did these 3 things and they worked. And we have no way of knowing whether those 3 things worked because they actually made an impact, or they happened to coincide with something else that was happening that worked, or whether it would work across a range of contexts. But we as research academics are certainly not incentivized to write any of those kinds of papers, right? I don't know about you, but like
Yeah.
I don't get
yeah,
any credit for those at my
No.
university.
no,
So, I think the people that are spending a lot of time doing that empirical research that can actually be somewhat generalizable aren't publishing in those kinds of venues. And so you end up with a lot of consultants that are doing work, kind of reflecting on their own experience. And so again, is it not true? I don't know that it's not true, but it certainly is not tested in many cases. And that's a problem.
Well, I think it's important what you just said about the, you don't get any points for that, right? So you don't get money, you don't get, I don't know, climbing up the rankings. These things usually don't even get cited a lot. However, as an empiricist, the field research, they open doors. They literally make your work down the track a lot easier because these things get read a lot more. They get more media attention. The press covers it. I don't know, like CIO cycles, sort of stuff. And then literally that next project, that next company that you want to get your foot in the door, it'll actually help with that. So if you don't look for immediate gratification benefits from these sorts of things, and if you look at it, all right, these are things that will help me do better research with better cases and cooler companies down the track, I do think they help a lot. Not in academia, in our little bubble, but in the real world, they do leave an impact.
It's all the sort of indirect kinds of things, right? That they have indirect benefits. Every HBR piece that I've published has, generated way more emails for me than any academic article I've ever published.
Absolutely.
Because they are much more widely read, and people are struggling right now with the problem that you're talking about. And so they want to talk about it. And many times that leads, just as you say, right, to open doors for more data collection.
I actually want to do that. I've done a couple. I did one with you, Recker, where we did I think California Management Review. So I want to try a couple of those, I guess, for the same reason. Paul, you say you're doing consulting and it's fun. I did consulting before coming to academia. So for me, that's not really the challenge. I love the research stuff. But I would like to play around with that genre of practitioner, and I'd want to do it a different way somehow. And I'm not sure how, but I want to try and guard against snake oil, which I have to say, not every article that you read in HBR or whatever is snake oil. Some of it's just beautiful, right? But I think that there's a significant there's a pressure to do the snake oil salesman bit, right? And no, I want to do that. I think that's going to be my next 10 years. I'm going to try and get a paper in HBR nice. Or Sloan Management or one of these places. What do you think?
So So I think it's important to set yourself a bunch of different stretch goals, right? So nice question to probably close up this episode, Paul. Do you have a particular goal for the new year or something for the next 5 years? You just said 10 years. Something you want to do that's a little bit different. Nick wants to write a book. Nick, didn't you say at one stage you wanted to write a book?
Eventually. I have 6 books in me. Paul's my role model. He actually writes the books. I just think about them and never write them. But there are books in me waiting to get out. I just never write them.
There's books in all of us, aren't there? Better than books about us, I guess.
Yeah. Well,
goals. I've been having fun building up this new department at UCSB.
Are you the head of the department?
Pardon me?
Are you the head of the department?
I am.
No?
Yeah.
And so you're an academic administrator.
I am. And I came here about 9 years ago to UCSB. And the idea was to take this little program that really just did undergraduate, some random undergraduate courses, and build it into a department. And so we've done that, got a professional master's program and a PhD, and been able to recruit some really great scholars at the intersection of technology and organizations. So that's been fun. More administrative stuff. I don't know, bureaucracy feels like it kills me. So I don't know about that. I don't know. I feel a little aimless, to be honest. I don't,
taking you and putting you in academic administration is like taking a thoroughbred horse and having him pull your plow, right? I mean, come on. But then at the same time, that thoroughbred horse at one point doesn't want to run in races the same way they used to. But here, Paul, you're 30 years old, right? So
you look like 30 years old, that's for sure.
You have 30 more years of research productivity.
That's way too long.
Yeah.
So Nick's gonna write this book and try to do something for practitioner for a while, not just for the social theorist. That's nice. You're building a department. I don't want to write anything, to be honest. My stretch goal would be to not write anything for a year, because I think I want to get bored so I get a really good idea, which I don't think I've ever had. So, you know, and
Wait,
maybe
you don't
I've
write
never had
anyway,
it.
Wrecker. You just
That's
edit.
a good idea, actually.
I just edit, yeah. Yeah, like the year I didn't write, and then I write about the year that I didn't write or something like this. Anyway, so I do think that's a good idea. I haven't done that yet, but yeah, I do think that's a good idea just to
it is an interesting idea because you do get to a point on a lot of your projects where you got so many different things that are getting reviewed and you're working with students and you're doing all of these things and it's hard to take time out to have a deep thought.
It's not only that. I do think also it's a little bit of the enjoyment is lacking. And I give you two examples. I mean, I recently had a paper finally accepted, and like it takes years and years and years. And I wasn't, generally, of course, I was happy when your paper has been accepted, even though when that came, but I wasn't really, really happy. And then, a week or two later, we got one of these third or fourth round rejections. And I wasn't really upset about it either. Like none of these two things, the positive or the negative, evoked a lot of emotions in me. I was like, well, that can't be good, right? So you gotta, I'd much rather be really upset and really frustrated and angry about the rejection, and really happy dancing naked in the rain kind of thing when I get the acceptance. And given that I didn't experience
how awful both of you sound to me right now. So I am the representative of the man of the people here, right? And as a man of the people, talking to you two, a couple of elites, all right, this is what I'm hearing. I'm hearing, oh, Wrecker and Paul, both of you, I've achieved at a very high level. I've achieved at a high point in my career. Paul, Wrecker is the nucleus professor in German. I'm not sure what that means, but it's very important.
No one knows what that means.
He's holding it all
Paul,
together
of course, is you guys have achieved as much as you can possibly achieve. Wrecker, I know this. He pulls the ladder up behind him, right? He makes it very difficult to publish after he made his way. I don't think Paul does. I think Paul is a generous reviewer and editor. But at the same time, you can't take a year off of writing. There are young people who want this career that the two of you have achieved, and they could use some mentorship. And you've both had mentors. You both collaboratively worked and benefited from it. And now it's your turn to give back to those young people. So that year that you don't want to write, I think that year you need to guide young people, Wrecker, and not be so selfish.
Yeah, because I'm a very selfish person, unlike Nick, for example. Anyway, we'll leave that to a separate episode. We'll actually fire back at all his stupid criticism.
Well, I did want to say, can I just sneak in one more thing? Because I am sensitive to the fact that maybe we've done a little bit complaining throughout this. And you did start, Nick, by asking, what are the secrets, right, to publishing, and especially for young people. And I think I mentioned that I don't think there are any secrets. However, I do want to say that there are two things that I think are really important for people to remember. Number one is you have to do good work. Like there's no shortcut. There's no way that you're going to write shitty findings that are going to make them seem amazing. There's no way that you're going to have amazing findings and write shitty and they sound amazing. You need to do good work and be invested in it and do the reading and do the time in the field and get your measures right and operationalize your variables in clear ways. So you got to do good work. There's just no shortcut. And then the second is you just have to be persistent. And I think that maybe a little what you're hearing from me and Jan is that persistence wears you out a bit over time, but you have to be persistent because for every paper that got accepted, there's a paper that got rejected, at least on my CV. And every paper that looks like it was oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. And it was so easy, had to go through 3 or 4 rounds of review in order to get there. And every one of those, I'm like, I don't want to do this. And so you got to just be persistent and try to learn from every iteration. And what can I do better? And unfortunately, over time, I feel like you don't actually get that much better. What you do get better at is recognizing early on the things that are likely to work and the things that are likely not to work so that you can cut the bad things off early and you can give more nutrients to the things that are likely to be successful. But that doesn't mean that you're going to have a paper that gets accepted in 1 round. It's going to still mean it's going to be 3 or 4 rounds, but hopefully you have fewer of the ones that get totally rejected along the way.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Very nice closing statement. Paul, it was a pleasure having you. You are now free to go and have breakfast. and coffee and whatever else you do at this time of the day.
If anybody else in my house is awake yet.
Yeah. Your kids, you have kids, you said, right? So
I
they're a
do.
little bit
Got
older.
Three,
They
three
still
girls.
sleep. Three girls.
Well,
That's good.
Yeah, the oldest is just about 13.
All right. Well, that's wonderful.
What's the
They're probably
youngest?
sleeping longer than you.
Yeah. Oh,
What's the range? 13 to what?
The youngest is 10. Or 9.
Oh,
She's just
stacked them up quickly. Very nice.
Yeah, no, they came fast and furiously.
All right. Well, it was a pleasure having you on, and actually
Thanks.
for me, it was beautiful to meet you. To be honest, we've never
likewise.
met.
I've enjoyed listening to your podcast for a while now, so it's a great privilege to be on and chat with both of you.
Thank you.
Oh wow, Wrecker, Paul's our listener.
Yeah, I know. He told me
you
it's amazing. Yeah,
it's
great.
It's like, it's a fun,
endorsement.
easy podcast to listen to because I feel like I learned something, but I didn't have to pay like 100% attention the entire time and take notes.
This is how we do it. We don't pay a lot of attention either.
I don't think that's true. I think you're a good conversationalist and you pick good guests and you ask good questions. And that's really the key to any podcast, right? Because you want to listen to a podcast and you want to like what you're hearing. So,
all right. Well, it was great having you on. Yep.
Paul, see you soon, man.
All
Appreciate
right.
it.
Take care, guys.
See you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.